They say the West was won with iron and sweat, but it was paid for in blood and ash. For every cattle baron who built an empire, there was a homesteader whose dreams were buried beneath it. This is the story of one such woman, Abigail Hayes. They thought a simple fire could erase her from the map that she would scatter like dust in the wind. They burned her home, stole her future, and salted the earth with her tears. But from those very ashes, a different kind of fire was forged. She didn't come back with a posse or a bounty hunter. She came back wearing a U.S. Marshal's star on her chest. And this time, she was the law. The first time Bartholomew Thorne came to call, he did so with a bottle of French wine and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a practiced, predatory smile, the kind a wolf might offer a lamb just before showing its teeth. Abigail Hayes met him on the porch of the small, sturdy cabin her late husband Thomas had built with his own 2 hands. The scent of pine from the surrounding woods and damp earth from the newly tilled fields clung to the air. This was her sanctuary, her entire world centered on the lifeblood of the valley Blackwood Creek. Mrs. Hayes Thorne began his voice, a low, confident rumble that seemed to command the very landscape. He was a broad-shouldered man dressed in a tailored suit that looked out of place, yet entirely natural on him. I trust you are settling in well, despite your loss. Abigail's grip tightened on the porch railing. Thomas had been gone 6 months, taken by a fever that had swept through the territory. I'm managing, Mr. Thorne. This land is good to those who work it. Indeed, he said, his gaze sweeping over her 160 acres, but his eyes lingered on the creek that bisected her property. It was the only reliable water source for 10 miles in any direction. His massive cattle operation, the Triple T Ranch, bordered her land on 3 sides, and his herds were growing thirsty, which is why I have come with a proposition, a generous one. I am prepared to offer you $500 for the deed, cash. It was more money than Abigail had ever seen, enough to go back east to live a comfortable, safe life. But it wasn't about the money. This land was my husband's dream, Mr. Thorne. Now it's mine. It's not for sale. Thorne's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Every person has a price, Mrs. Hayes. I would urge you to reconsider. Progress has a certain momentum. It would be a shame for a lone woman to stand in its way. The threat was veiled, but it hung in the air between them as heavy and suffocating as summer humidity. He left the wine bottle on her porch steps. Abigail let it sit there until the sun turned it sour. Then she poured it into the dirt. The second visit wasn't from Thorne. It was from 2 of his men, a pair of hard-faced riders known as the Connolly brothers. Declan, the older one, had a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a permanent sneer. Ronan was younger, quieter, with eyes that darted about like a nervous coyote. They didn't bring wine. They rode their horses through her vegetable garden, trampling the young shoots into the mud. The boss ain't a patient man. Declan grunted, looking down at her from his saddle. He thinks you might have misunderstood his generosity. Abigail stood her ground, Thomas's old Winchester rifle held loosely in her hands. She wasn't a gunslinger, but she knew how to use it. There was no misunderstanding. Get off my property. Ronan nudged his horse closer, his hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip. That's Triple T land you're standing on. You just don't know it yet. They left after that, but the message was clear. The warnings escalated. A fence cut in the night, allowing a dozen of Thorne's steers to wander in and ruin a week's worth of work. Whispers in the nearby town of Redemption, a town that was slowly being renamed Thorne's Crossing in common parlance. The shopkeeper, Mr. Abernathy, suddenly couldn't extend her any more credit. The local sheriff, a paunchy, lazy man named Miller, who was deep in Thorne's pocket, told her she was stirring up trouble. Abigail didn't back down. She worked harder, sleeping less, her hands becoming calloused and her face weathered by the sun and worry. She was fighting for more than land. She was fighting for the last piece of Thomas she had left. The final visit came on a moonless autumn night. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of winter. Abigail was asleep exhausted when the smell first pricked her senses. It wasn't the familiar scent of her wood stove, it was acrid and angry. Smoke. Her eyes flew open. An orange glow flickered against her window pane. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She scrambled from her bed to the floorboards, already warm beneath her bare feet. The living area was filled with thick black smoke. Through the haze, she could see the source flames were licking up the front of the cabin, devouring the dry timber with a hungry roar. She grabbed two things, the tin box from under her bed that held the deed to her land and her husband's Colt peacemaker. The Winchester was lost to the fire. Choking her eyes streaming, she stumbled towards the back window, the one Thomas had always meant to fix. She threw her shoulder against it, and the frame splintered, giving way. She tumbled out into the cold night air, gasping, her lungs burning. The entire cabin was an inferno. The barn was next, the panicked whinnies of her mule Bess cutting through the crackle of the flames. She tried to run for the barn to save the poor animal, but the heat was a solid wall driving her back. Then she saw them, 3 figures on horseback silhouetted against the blaze. One was large and unmistakable, even from a distance, Bartholomew Thorne watching his progress unfold. The other 2 were the Connolly brothers. As she watched from the shadows of the woods, a wave of sickness and rage washing over her, she saw Ronan dismount and walk to the well. He carried a heavy sack. With a grunt, he poured its contents down into the dark water. Salt. He was not just taking her land, he was poisoning it, making sure nothing could ever grow here again. Tears streamed down her soot-stained face, hot and furious. It wasn't grief she felt, not the quiet sorrow she'd felt after Thomas's death. This was a different emotion entirely. It was a cold, hard knot of hate forming in her belly. They thought they had burned her out, erased her. They had taken her home, her livelihood, her past. But as she watched them ride away, their dark shapes swallowed by the night, Abigail Hayes made a vow. They had left her with nothing, but she would return with something they could never buy or burn. She would return with the law. She turned her back on the smouldering ruins of her life and walked away, the precious deed held tight against her chest and the cold steel of the revolver, a heavy, final promise in her hand. She didn't know where she was going, only that she would be back, and when she returned, redemption would live up to its name. The next 2 years were a crucible for Abigail Hayes. She drifted south into the Arizona Territory, a land even more vast and unforgiving than the one she'd left behind. The woman who had once nurtured seedlings from the earth now took on the hardest, most thankless jobs. She washed dishes in grimy saloons, mended clothes for prospectors, and even worked for a short time on a trail drive where the cowboys' surprise at her grit quickly turned to grudging respect. The softness in her face hardened into sharp angles. Her hands, once calloused from farming, became scarred and tough from 100 different labors. She learned to read men, not by their words, but by the way their eyes shifted, the way their hand hovered near their gun. She learned to be invisible when she needed to be, and to project an aura of quiet danger when she couldn't. The grief for Thomas remained a constant ache in her heart, but it was now overlaid with a cold, clear purpose that was as solid and unyielding as granite. She spent her meager earnings not on comforts, but on ammunition. Every spare hour was spent in the desert, far from prying eyes with her late husband's Colt peacemaker. At first her shots were wild, her hands unsteady. But she practiced with a fanatic's devotion. She learned to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it, to draw the heavy weapon with a speed that came from muscle memory, not brute force. The gun was no longer just a memento, it was an extension of her will. Her life changed in the dusty, booming town of Prescott. She witnessed a drunkard, a failed silver miner, attempting to rob a freight office. The clerk was a young boy, paralyzed with fear. While the other bystanders scattered, Abigail acted. She didn't draw her gun. She simply stepped in front of the robber, her eyes level and cold. "You don't want to do this," she said, her voice low and steady. The man, startled by her calm, waved his pistol wildly. "Get out of my way, woman. He has nothing for you but trouble," she continued, taking another slow step forward. "But I've got $1 in my pocket. It'll buy you a bottle. Walk away now and it's yours. Try to use that gun, and you'll be dead before you hit the floor." There was no quaver in her voice, only a chilling certainty. The man hesitated, his drunken bravado crumbling under her intense gaze. He saw something in her eyes that scared him more than an empty safe. He lowered his gun, snatched the $1 she offered, and stumbled out into the street. The entire exchange had been watched from across the street by a man leaning against a post. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and a thick grey mustache. A silver star was pinned to his vest, a U.S. Marshal. His name was Rhett Donovan, a man whose reputation for integrity was as solid as the mountains. He walked over his boot heels, making a measured rhythm on the boardwalk. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice a dry drawl. "Perhaps it was just necessary." Abigail replied, her guard still up. Donovan studied her for a long moment. "I saw your eyes. You weren't bluffing. You would have killed him." "I would have stopped him," she corrected. The method was his to choose. Donovan was intrigued. He'd seen countless men try to enforce their will with bluster and violence. He'd rarely seen it done with such quiet, unshakable resolve. He bought her a coffee in the hotel dining room, and for the first time in 2 years, Abigail told her story. She left out the names and the specific location, speaking only of a powerful rancher, a stolen farm, and a fire in the night. Donovan listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. When she was finished, he nodded slowly. "The law is a clumsy tool, Mrs. Hayes. Sometimes it's a scalpel, other times a sledgehammer. And sometimes the men who hold it are the worst kind of criminals. But it's all we have that stands between order and chaos, between men like that rancher and the complete subjugation of everyone else." He leaned forward. "You've got a fire in you. Not the wild kind that burns everything down, but the kind you find in a forge. The kind that can shape steel. The West is full of men who want to be the law. I'm looking for people who want to serve it." It was an offer that defied all convention. A woman as a deputy U.S. Marshal was virtually unheard of. But Rhett Donovan was a man who cared about results, not tradition. He saw in Abigail not a victim seeking revenge, but a survivor with the raw material of an exceptional law officer, intelligence, courage, and a deep personal understanding of injustice. For the next year, under Donovan's tutelage, Abigail Hayes was reforged. She learned the law poring over books of statutes and warrants until her eyes burned. He taught her how to track a man across the open plains to read the story left in hoofprints and broken twigs. He refined her skill with the Colt and taught her how to handle a shotgun and a rifle with equal proficiency. She learned how to conduct an investigation, how to ask questions that peeled back layers of lies, and most importantly, how to use the power of her badge with restraint and authority. She wasn't just learning skills. She was building a new identity, The farmer's wife was gone, burned away in the fire. In her place was Deputy Marshal Hayes, a woman whose only allegiance was to the letter of the law. Her desire for retribution against Bartholomew Thorne had not faded. It had simply been tempered, shaped from a raw emotional need for revenge into a cold, calculated pursuit of justice. Justice was a warrant, a trial, and a verdict. It was clean and irrefutable. One cool morning, Marshal Donovan handed her an official-looking document and a new silver star polished to a high shine. There's a circuit judge heading up toward the redemption territory. Reports of civil disputes, and a local lawman who seems to be compromised. The judge will need a federal escort and an impartial investigator on the ground. He looked at her, his expression serious. This is it, Abigail. You don't have to take it. Once you pin that star on your past is your own, but your future belongs to the Justice Department. You'll be representing the United States government. You'll face Thorne not as the woman he wronged, but as an instrument of federal law. Can you make that distinction? Abigail picked up the star. It was heavy in her palm. She thought of the smell of smoke, the sound of her mule's cries, the sight of Thorne watching her life turn to ash. She looked at Donovan, and her voice was steady, devoid of the rage that once consumed her. "Yes, sir," she said. "He broke the law. I'm going to arrest him for it." She pinned the star to her worn leather vest. It sat over her heart, a cold, comforting weight. She was no longer just Abigail Hayes, the dispossessed homesteader. She was the law, and she was going home. Riding back into the valley was like stepping into a distorted memory. The landscape was the same, the jagged peaks in the distance, the wide sweep of the sky, but the heart of it had been corrupted. The town of Redemption was now officially Thorne's Crossing. A large, ostentatious sign, paid for by Thorne himself, hung over the main street. The town looked more prosperous. The storefronts had fresh paint, and a new, larger saloon, the Gilded Spur, dominated the street. But it was the prosperity of a company town, brittle and hollow. Fear was the currency here, and everyone was in debt to Bartholomew Thorne. Abigail Hayes rode in not as a spectre from the past, but as an agent of the future. She wore a plain duster, her badge hidden beneath it. Her hat was pulled low, casting her face in shadow. Her hair, once long, was now tied back in a severe knot. 2 years had changed her enough that she wasn't immediately recognizable, but she knew a single slip could unravel her mission before it began. She stabled her horse, a sturdy buckskin named Justice, and took a room at the boarding house, signing the register as A. Hayes. Her stated purpose was simple. She was an agent for the Department of the Interior, surveying land and water rights disputes in the territory. It was a plausible cover one that would allow her to ask the right kind of questions. Her first stop was the sheriff's office. The man behind the desk was not the useless Sheriff Miller. This man was younger, with a lean frame, a clean-shaven jaw and wary eyes. A tin star was pinned to his shirt. A nameplate on the desk read, "Deputy Finn Riley." "Help you, Ma'am Riley," asked, his posture stiffly professional. Marshal Hayes Abigail said, flipping open her duster to reveal the star. She watched his eyes for a flicker of recognition, but saw only surprise, followed by a guarded curiosity. U.S. Marshal's Office. "I'm here on federal business regarding a number of complaints filed with the Circuit Judge's office." Riley stood up, a reflexive gesture of respect for the badge, if not for the woman wearing it. "Complaints, we keep the peace here, Marshal." The peace, Abigail said, her gaze sweeping the tidy office, is a matter of perspective. "Where's Sheriff Miller retired?" Riley said quickly. A little too quickly. "Came into some money. Moved on." "Good for him," Abigail said, her tone flat. "I'll be in town for a while. I expect your full cooperation, Deputy." "Of course, Marshal," he said, but his eyes said something else. He was a man walking a tightrope, and she had just set it swaying. Abigail spent the next few days in quiet observation, a ghost moving through her own past. She walked the perimeter of her old land. A new, formidable barbed wire fence now enclosed it. The creek flowed through pastures teeming with Triple T cattle. The blackened foundation of her cabin was still visible, a dark scar on the land, but Thorn hadn't even bothered to clear it. It was a monument to his victory. Seeing it didn't ignite the old fire in her belly. Instead, it settled into a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't about a cabin anymore. It was about a man who believed he was above the law. She spoke to the townsfolk one by one. She started with Abernathy, the general store owner. He was visibly nervous, his hands trembling as he weighed out beans for her. "I'm investigating land acquisition practices," she said, keeping her voice low. "Specifically reports of coercion." Abernathy paled. "I don't know anything about that. Mr. Thorn is a benefactor to this town, a pillar of the community. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He was a good man, trapped in a cage of fear. It was the same everywhere she went. The blacksmith, the hotel clerk, the stable hand, they all recited the same mantra of Thorn's generosity, their eyes filled with a terror that contradicted every word. Thorn didn't rule with overt violence anymore. He didn't need to. The memory of the fire, of what happened to the woman at Blackwood Creek, was enough. He ruled through economic strangulation and the silent threat of what he was capable of. Her investigation felt like punching fog. She had no witnesses, no one willing to speak a word against the king. All she had was the truth, and the truth was useless without proof. Deputy Riley was a puzzle. He was Thorn's man, a fact confirmed by the whispers she overheard. He had been a ranch hand at the Triple T before Miller's convenient retirement. Yet he didn't have the swagger of Thorn's other men. There was a tension in him, a conflict in his gaze whenever she spoke to him. He was polite, efficient, and utterly unhelpful, answering her questions with carefully rehearsed non-answers. One evening, seeking a moment of solitude, Abigail rode out to the small, neglected cemetery at the edge of town. She went to Thomas's grave. The simple wooden marker was still there, weathered but standing. She knelt, clearing away some weeds, the simple act grounding her. "I'm sorry, Thomas," she whispered to the wind. "I'm sorry I had to leave you. But I couldn't let him win. I have to see this through." As she stood up, a voice came from behind her. "It's a hard thing, losing family." She turned her hand, instinctively moving toward her duster. It was Finn Riley standing by the cemetery gate, his hat in his hands. "What do you want?" Deputy Abigail asked, her voice sharp. He gestured with his hat toward a different section of the cemetery where the graves were older. "My father is buried over there. Died in a cattle stampede 10 years back. On Triple T land." Abigail was silent, waiting. "Thorn was very generous," Riley continued, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Paid for the funeral, gave my mother a pension, gave me my first job, told me he'd always look out for me, that a man has to be loyal to those who help him." He looked directly at her now, and for the first time, she saw past the deputy's mask to the man beneath. She saw a deep, simmering resentment. "What kind of law are you looking to bring here, Marshal?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The kind that gets written in books, or the kind that gets things done? The kind that holds every man accountable, Mr. Riley, no matter how big his shadow is." He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent, desperate conversation passing between them. He seemed on the verge of saying more, but then his jaw tightened. He nodded curtly, put his hat back on and walked away, leaving Abigail alone with the dead, and a flicker of something she hadn't expected, a sliver of hope that she wasn't entirely alone in her fight. The deputy was compromised, yes, but he was also wounded. And a wounded man could be unpredictable. The stalemate had to be broken. Abigail knew that quiet questions and veiled inquiries would get her nowhere. Bartholomew Thorne was an expert at managing the quiet fears of a town. To get to him, she needed to make a loud noise. She needed to rattle the cage and see who fell off the perch. Her target, the Connolly brothers. They were the muscle, the public face of Thorne's brutality. And of the two, Ronan was the weak link, younger jumpier, and more prone to mistakes. Her opportunity came on a Saturday night. The gilded spur was packed the air thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, sweat, and desperation. Abigail sat at a small table in the corner, nursing a lukewarm coffee, her eyes scanning the room. As expected, Declan and Ronan Connolly were holding court at the bar, their laughter loud and arrogant. They were celebrating a successful cattle sale, and Thorne was footing the bill. Ronan, fueled by liquor, got into an argument with a prospector over a game of cards. Voices were raised, a chair was shoved back. Ronan, his face flushed, drew his Colt and pistol-whipped the older man across the face, sending him sprawling to the floor, bleeding. The saloon went silent. Everyone looked at Ronan, then at the door, expecting him to walk away with impunity, as he always did. But this time was different. Abigail stood up the legs of her chair, scraping loudly on the floorboards. She walked calmly toward the bar. Her duster unbuttoned the star on her vest, catching the lamplight. "Ronan Connolly," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "You're under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon." Declan stepped in front of his brother, a smirk on his face. "Now hold on, Marshal. It was just a misunderstanding. The old man cheated." "Then your brother's complaint is with the cards, not the man's skull," Abigail replied, her gaze locked on Ronan. "Step aside, Declan. You've got no authority here." Declan snarled his hand, dropping to his gun belt. "Sheriff Riley handles the law in this town." As if on cue, Finn Riley pushed through the batwing doors drawn by the commotion. He took in the scene the bleeding prospector, the defiant Connollys, and the unmoving U.S. Marshal. "Marshal, this is a local matter." Riley started, his voice strained. It became a federal matter when he drew a weapon in a public place with intent to cause grievous harm. Abigail countered, never taking her eyes off her target. "Now, Deputy, you have a choice. You can uphold the law with me, or you can be an accessory to obstructing a federal officer. What's it going to be?" She had put him on the spot in front of the whole town. Every eye was on him. This was the moment his loyalty would be publicly tested. He looked from Declan's menacing glare to Abigail's unyielding stare. After a tense silence that stretched for an eternity, Riley slowly moved to stand beside her. "You heard the Marshal." Declan Riley said, his voice tight. "Back away." Declan's face contorted with rage and disbelief. He had been challenged, his power questioned, but he was staring down 2 badges now and a saloon full of witnesses. With a curse, he backed down his eyes, promising murder. Abigail stepped forward and smoothly disarmed the stunned Ronan. "Let's go," she said, cuffing his hands behind his back. As she led him out, the saloon erupted in hushed, frantic whispers. The first crack in Thorne's empire had appeared. She locked Ronan in one of the jail's 2 cells. Declan raged outside the office for an hour before storming off, presumably to report to Thorne. "You just signed your death warrant," Riley said to her once they were alone. "I signed an arrest warrant, Deputy." "There's a difference," she replied, pulling a chair up to Ronan's cell. Her interrogation was a masterclass in psychological warfare, built on everything Rhett Donovan had taught her. She didn't threaten or shout. She was quiet, patient. She spoke of the inevitability of federal justice, of long prison sentences in places like Yuma, a name that struck fear into the hearts of most men. She talked about his brother Declan. Declan is smart, she said, her voice conversational. He'll tell Thorne you were drunk and stupid. Thorne will cut you loose. He has to. He can't be seen protecting a common thug who attacks old men in public. But Declan, he'll walk free. You'll be the one taking the fall, all of it. Ronan spat on the floor. Go to hell, I might, Abigail said calmly. But you'll get to Yuma long before I do. Unless you have something to offer. Something that might interest a federal judge. Something that might paint you as a man who was coerced, not a willing accomplice. She let those words hang in the air and left him to stew in the dark. She knew it wouldn't be that easy, but she had planted the seed of betrayal. The twist she was waiting for came from the one person she least expected. Late that night, there was a soft knock on the back door of the sheriff's office. It was Finn Riley. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. You have to be careful, he whispered, stepping inside. Thorne is meeting with his lawyer. He's not going to let this go. I'm counting on it, Abigail said. Why are you here? Riley Finn hesitated, his internal conflict warring on his face. He finally reached inside his coat and pulled out a small, worn leather ledger. He placed it on the desk. My father. The stampede that killed him wasn't an accident. Finn said, his voice thick with a decade of suppressed grief and anger. He was a foreman for Thorne. He found out Thorne was rebranding stolen cattle from Mexico. My father was a decent man. He confronted Thorne. A week later, he was dead, trampled by a spooked herd. Thorne called it a tragedy. I was just a kid. I believed him. He pushed the ledger toward her. My father kept meticulous records. Everything is in here. Shipments, dates, discrepancies. The brand he used to cover the Mexican ones. It's not enough to prove murder, but it's enough to prove he's a thief and a liar. It's a start. Abigail opened the ledger. The pages were filled with neat, precise columns of numbers and notes. It was damning. It was the proof she needed that Thorne's empire was built on a foundation of crime. Why now, Finn? She asked softly. For years I told myself I was keeping my family safe by working for him. But tonight, when you faced down the Connollys, you were upholding the law I'm supposed to represent. My father would have been ashamed of me. I'm done being Thorne's man. Suddenly the front door of the office burst open. Declan Connolly stood there, a shotgun in his hands. Behind him were two of Thorne's toughest ranch hands. Declan's eyes fixed on the ledger on the desk, then on Finn's pale, treacherous face. Well, well. Declan sneered, leveling the shotgun. Looks like the rats are finally coming out of the woodwork. Before Abigail or Finn could react, the back of the office exploded in a shower of glass as another of Thorne's men smashed a window and leveled a rifle. They were trapped. Thorne wasn't just going to obstruct justice, he was going to bury it right here, right now. The world narrowed to the confines of the sheriff's office. The smell of shattered glass and oiled steel filled the air. Declan Connolly's grin was a death mask. Thorne sends his regards, Marshal. He says your tenure in his town is officially over. Abigail's mind worked with lightning speed. 2 guns in front, 1 behind. Ronan was locked in his cell, useless. It was a kill box. But they had made a mistake. They assumed she and Finn were just 2 people. They had forgotten she was a marshal. Finn the desk, she yelled. In one fluid motion, she drew her Colt and fired not at Declan, but at the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling. The room plunged into darkness, the single gunshot deafening in the enclosed space. Glass shattered. Kerosene splashed. Chaos erupted. One of the men at the door fired blindly, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the room. Abigail was already moving, dropping low, using the large oak desk as cover. Finn, reacting on pure instinct, did the same. "He's got my father's ledger," Finn yelled in the dark, a new desperation in his voice. Declan cursed, scrambling for the book. "Light a match." It was the opening Abigail needed. A ranch hand fumbled to strike a lucifer. In the brief, flickering flare, she saw his silhouette. She fired once. The man grunted and fell. The match died. "Get the book and get out," Declan roared to his remaining man. From behind them, a new voice cut through the darkness. "Drop it, Declan." It was Ronan, his voice shaking from inside his cell. "Don't do this!" "Shut up, you fool!" Declan screamed, his focus fractured. That was the second mistake. He was distracted. Finn, emboldened, rose up from behind the desk and fired his own revolver, the shot going wide, but forcing Declan and his man to duck. Abigail used the diversion to circle around the side of the room. She came up behind the man at the shattered back window and brought the barrel of her Colt down hard on the back of his head. He crumpled without a sound. Now it was just Declan. He knew he was outmaneuvered. He grabbed the ledger from the desk, fired one last wild shot in Abigail's general direction, and bolted out the front door into the night. Silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of the man she'd pistol-whipped, and Ronan's panicked breathing from the cell. Finn lit another lamp, his hands shaking. The office was a wreck of splintered wood and broken glass. "He has the evidence," Finn said, his face ashen. "He has a book," Abigail corrected, reloading her Colt with steady hands. "We have a confession waiting to happen." She looked toward Ronan's cell. The younger Connolly brother was pale with terror. He had seen his brother willing to leave him to die in a shootout. His loyalty was shattered. It took less than 10 minutes for Ronan to tell her everything. He confessed to the assault, to the years of intimidation on Thorne's orders, and most importantly, to his role on the night of the fire. He described how Thorne sat on his horse and watched it burn, how they'd salted the well on his direct command. He signed a full confession, his hand trembling so badly his signature was nearly illegible. "That's enough for a federal warrant," Abigail said, her voice grimly satisfied. "Finn, you know the territory. Is there a telegraph office? Thorne doesn't own North Ridge. It's a 10-mile ride, but it connects to the army post at Fort Grant. Wire Marshal Donovan in Prescott. Tell him I have a signed confession implicating Bartholomew Thorne in arson, conspiracy, and destruction of property. Tell him I am serving a warrant for his arrest at dawn and require immediate federal support. Then deputize any man in this town brave enough to stand with us." I'm not waiting for Donovan's reply. We're going now. As Finn rode out, Abigail faced a town still cowering in the dark, but the gunfight at the sheriff's office had been a seismic event. News spread like wildfire. Something had changed. The law wasn't a joke anymore. When Finn returned an hour later, he wasn't alone. Old Man Abernathy, the storekeeper, stood beside him, holding a double-barreled shotgun, his face a mixture of terror and resolve. The blacksmith was with him, along with 3 other ranchers, whom Thorne had been squeezing for years. It was a small, grim-faced posse, but it was a start. At first light, Abigail rode at the head of her small column. She wore her duster, open her marshal's star gleaming in the rising sun. They rode toward the sprawling Triple T ranch, a veritable fortress with its high walls and dozens of loyal ranch hands. They were met at the main gate by Declan Connolly and a dozen riders all armed. "This is private property," Marshal Declan sneered, though his bravado was thinner now. "Turn around. I have a warrant for the arrest of Bartholomew Thorne. Abigail announced her voice carrying across the yard. "Issued on the sworn testimony of your brother, Ronan Connolly. Stand aside, or you will all be charged with obstructing a federal marshal." Thorne himself appeared on the veranda of his opulent ranch house, a rifle in his hand. He looked not at Abigail, but at the townsman behind her. "Abernathy, you old fool, I built this town. I gave you all prosperity. And you side with this woman. She'll bring you nothing but ruin. You brought us fear." Thorne Abernathy shouted back, his voice cracking but firm. "She brought us hope." That was all it took. The first shot was fired, it was impossible to say by who, and the yard erupted into a full-scale firefight. Abigail's posse, though, outnumbered, used their knowledge of the terrain, taking cover behind wagons and water troughs. Finn Riley fought with a cold fury, his movements precise and deadly, avenging his father with every shot. Abigail wasn't fighting like a soldier. She was fighting like a lawman. Her goal wasn't to kill, but to advance. She moved from cover to cover, her eyes fixed on the main house on Thorne. Declan, blinded by rage, charged from behind cover to get a clear shot at her. It was a fatal mistake. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously, one from Abigail's Colt, one from Finn's. Declan staggered, clutching his chest, and fell into the dust, his reign of terror over. The remaining ranch hands, seeing their field commander fall, lost their nerve. Some threw down their guns while others fled. The fight was broken. Abigail stormed up the steps of the veranda. Thorne, seeing his forces collapse, raised his rifle to fire at her. She was faster. Her shot hit the rifle, splintering the stock and sending it flying from his hands. He stared at his stinging palms, then at her, his face a mask of disbelief. "It's over, Thorne," she said, advancing on him, her peacemaker steady. He backed away, his arrogance finally cracking, revealing the desperate bully beneath. "You can't do this. I am this valley. Without me, it dies. This valley will finally have a chance to live," she said, stopping a foot from him. He was just a man, older and softer than she remembered. The monster in her memory was diminished by the light of day. For a fleeting second, the old raw hatred surged. The urge to pull the trigger to end it all right there was a physical force. But then she looked down at the star on her chest. She remembered Rhett Donovan's words. "You'll face him not as the woman he wronged, but as an instrument of federal law." She holstered her Colt and pulled out a pair of steel handcuffs. "Bartholomew Thorne," she said, her voice clear and cold, ringing with the full authority of the United States government. "You are under arrest." The click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists was the loudest sound in the valley. It was the sound of an empire falling. It was the sound of justice. The silence that fell over the Triple T ranch was heavier than the gunfire that had preceded it. Dust disturbed by panicked hooves, and falling men settled slowly in the morning light, coating everything in a fine brown film. The surviving ranch hands stood with their hands raised, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. The invincible empire of Bartholomew Thorne had crumbled in less than an hour. Abigail stood on the veranda, the Colt peacemaker, still warm in her hand. She watched as Finn Riley and Abernathy secured the prisoners, their movements, efficient and grim. The cost of this victory was laid bare in the yard. Declan Connolly's body lay still, near a water trough, a stark testament to the violence of the morning. 2 of Thorne's men were dead. One of their own, a rancher who had joined their cause, was wounded, being tended to by the blacksmith. Justice was never clean. It was always paid for in blood and sorrow. Thorne, his wrists bound in steel, was forced to his feet. The disbelief in his eyes had curdled into a venomous rage. He looked at Abigail, his face contorted. "You," he spat the word, dripping with contempt. "You think you've won. You've destroyed everything. This town will starve without me. You haven't brought justice. You've brought ruin, you vengeful witch." Abigail looked at him, and for the first time she felt nothing. The searing hatred, the gnawing need for revenge, it was all gone, burned out, and replaced by something colder and heavier. She was no longer the woman he had wronged. She was the consequence. "The people of this valley will build their own future, Thorn," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "One that isn't watered with their fear." "Take him away, deputy." Finn nodded, prodding Thorn forward. As he was led past her, a defeated king being frog-marched from his castle, Thorn made one last attempt to reclaim his power. "They'll never forget what you did here today." No, Abigail agreed quietly, her eyes on the wounded rancher being carried toward a wagon. "They won't." Back in town, the atmosphere was electric. People emerged from their homes, their expressions shifting from fear to cautious hope, as they saw Thorn and his men locked in the jail cells they had once controlled. Abigail's first duty was to Ronan Connolly. She found him huddled on the cot in his cell, a man broken by his own cowardice and his brother's betrayal. "Your brother is dead, Ronan," she stated, not unkindly. "You signed a confession. You testified against Thorn in principle. For that, the circuit judge might show leniency. You won't walk free, but you won't hang, and you might not die in Yuma. That's the best I can do for you." Ronan looked up, tears streaking his grimy face. I never wanted any of this." "Few men do," Abigail said, turning away. "But we are all judged by the choices we make when the killing starts." Her final piece of business was with Finn Riley. She found him standing outside the sheriff's office, staring at the nameplate on the door. He had already taken down the one that bore his name and was holding the old faded one that said Sheriff Miller. "Going to need a new one of these," Finn said, looking at her. The exhaustion on his face was warring with a newfound sense of purpose. The town council, such as it is, held a vote. They asked me to serve as sheriff. Properly this time. "There's no one better for the job," Abigail said, and she meant it. "You stood up when it counted, Finn, only because you showed us how he admitted." He held out the worn leather ledger. "This belongs to you. Or maybe it belongs in a fire." Abigail looked at the book that had cost his father his life. "No, it belongs to you. It's a reminder of what your father died for, and what you'll be living for." Finn nodded, clutching the ledger to his chest. A silent understanding passed between them. They were two people forged in the same fire, but destined for different anvils. His place was here to rebuild. Hers was elsewhere. Before she left town, there was one last place she had to go. She rode justice out to Blackwood Creek, to the 160 acres that had once been her entire world. The land was quiet. The barbed wire fence was a stark, ugly line against the horizon. She dismounted and walked to the blackened foundation of her home. The stones were cold. She knelt and picked up a handful of earth from near the well. It was gritty, sterile. The salt had done its work. She had thought this moment would be filled with pain, with a final heart-wrenching goodbye to Thomas and the life they had planned. But as she let the dead soil run through her fingers, she felt a profound and surprising sense of peace. The ghost of Abigail Hayes, the farmer's wife, did not haunt this place anymore. Her spirit wasn't tied to this soil. It had been forged anew, along with the star she wore. This wasn't her home. It was a grave, and she was done mourning. She stood, dusted off her hands, and looked out at the creek, still flowing indifferent to the dramas of men. The land would heal in time, and so would its people. But her path now led away from it. When she returned to the telegraph office, a fresh message was waiting for her. It was from Marshal Donovan. Hayes, troop detachment from Hefty Grant, en route to take custody of Thorn. Well done. Once secured, proceed to San Carlos territory. Dispute between miners and Apache agency. Situation volatile. Exercise caution. Donovan. It was not a commendation or a celebration. It was an order. A new fire to put out. A new line to hold. She found Finn saying goodbye to her by her horse. Abernathy was with him, his shotgun now resting peacefully in the crook of his arm. "We owe you everything," Marshall the old storekeeper said, his voice thick with emotion. Abigail shook her head. "You owe each other. You stood up. You fought for your own town. Never forget that you have that strength." She turned to Finn, offering her hand. He took it, his grip firm. "Safe travels, Abigail." It was the first time he had used her given name. "Keep the peace, Sheriff Riley," she replied with a small, rare smile. She swung herself up into the saddle. She was no longer running from a painful past or chasing a burning vengeance. She was riding toward a duty. The star on her chest felt heavier now, not with the weight of her own loss, but with the weight of the lore of the trust placed in her, and of the countless unheard voices in the vast, wild territory who needed a champion. She gave one last nod to the men who were rebuilding redemption, then turned Justice's head south toward the jagged mountains and the next town on the map. She didn't look back. Bartholomew Thorn was tried in a federal court. Ronan Connolly's confession, coupled with the evidence from Finn Riley's father's ledger, sealed his fate. He would spend the rest of his life in a prison far from the land he sought to conquer. The town of Redemption slowly shed its fear, and with Finn Riley elected as its new sheriff, it began the long process of healing. Abigail Hayes did not stay. She did not rebuild her farm or try to reclaim the woman she once was. That woman was gone, lost to the fire. In her place stood U.S. Deputy Marshal Hayes, a woman who had found her purpose not in vengeance, but in the unyielding pursuit of justice. Her personal war was over, but her duty was not. With a nod to her new allies and a final look at the valley she had liberated, she mounted her horse Justice and rode toward the horizon, where another town and another fight awaited. She learned that true strength isn't about getting even. It's about ensuring no one ever has to suffer the same injustice you did. The story of Abigail Hayes is a reminder that the line between civilization and chaos is often held by the will of a single determined person. If her journey from victim to victor moved you, please give this video a like to help us share her story with others. Share it with anyone who loves a tale of true grit and resilience. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon so you don't miss our next story from the forgotten pages of the Wild West. Thank you for listening.